The courtroom was packed, yet eerily silent. The dim glow of the chandelier reflected off the polished wooden benches, casting long shadows over the faces of anxious spectators. This was not just any trial, it was the reckoning of Victor Langley, a man once hailed as a financial genius, now standing as the accused in one of the most shocking fraud cases in the country. Victor walked in, his designer suit perfectly tailored, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He wore an air of indifference, as if this were a mere business meeting rather than a fight for his freedom. His smirk never faltered, even as the victim's eyes burned into him from the gallery. Among them was Elena Carter, a former schoolteacher whose life had been turned upside down. She had lost her home in Chicago, forced to live out of her aging Toyota Camry with her 6-year-old daughter. She clutched a faded photograph of her old house, her fingers trembling. Nearby, David Holloway, a retired Marine, sat stone-faced, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His entire life savings, his future, had vanished because of Langley's schemes. The air was thick with a mix of tension, anger, and fear. A frail old woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Somewhere in the back, a reporter scribbled furiously, knowing this case would dominate headlines for weeks. As the judge entered, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." And so began the trial that would determine whether Victor Langley would finally face the justice he had long evaded. Victor Langley sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable as the courtroom murmured with anticipation. He adjusted his cufflinks with slow, deliberate movements, as if he were preparing for a high-stakes negotiation rather than a criminal trial. The weight of a dozen cameras pressed against the thick glass of the courtroom doors, capturing every flicker of emotion. Though Langley offered them little to work with, for years he had been a symbol of untouchable wealth, a man whose golden touch turned investments into fortune, until the truth unraveled. His empire, Langley Capital, had been nothing more than an elaborate facade built on deception. He had promised stability, prosperity, and security to hardworking families, convincing them to entrust him with their life savings. In reality, their dreams had been funneled into his extravagant lifestyle. Penthouses overlooking the Manhattan skyline, vacations on private islands, and a fleet of luxury cars worth more than most people made in a lifetime. The prosecution wasted no time painting the real picture. "He is not a financial genius," the lead prosecutor, Michael Grayson, declared, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "He is a predator, and his victims, honest, hard-working Americans, were nothing more than stepping stones in his pursuit of greed." The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified bank statements, emails instructing employees to manipulate numbers, voice recordings of Langley laughing about his suckers who would never see it coming. The crowd gasped as each new revelation surfaced. But Victor, he remained unfazed. Even as Elena Carter took the stand, her voice trembling with emotion, he barely acknowledged her presence. She recounted the day she realized everything was gone. The moment she sat on her kitchen floor, clutching an eviction notice, while her daughter asked why they had to leave. "I trusted him," she whispered. "I believed every word he said." David Holloway's testimony was even more chilling. He spoke of his years serving his country, of his plans for a quiet retirement in a small home by the lake. Instead, he now relied on a cot in his brother's garage. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he clenched a military dog tag between his fingers. "This man didn't just steal money," he said, staring straight at Langley. "He stole futures." Despite the devastating testimonies, Victor Langley barely blinked. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally whispering to his attorney or checking his perfectly manicured nails. The arrogance was suffocating, filling the room like a thick, oppressive fog. But then came the breaking point. The prosecution displayed a series of emails, messages in which Langley explicitly instructed his team to falsify reports and push desperate clients to invest more. One line stood out, sending a collective shiver through the courtroom. "Bleed them dry. They'll crawl back for more." A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience, some gasping, others shaking their heads in disgust. Elena Carter covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking as silent tears streamed down her face. David Holloway's fists tightened, his jaw clenching with barely contained fury. For the first time, Victor's smirk faltered. Judge Margaret Holloway, an imposing figure with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of justice, studied him carefully from the bench. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning, "do you have anything to say about this?" Victor leaned forward, gripping the microphone as if he had a grand speech prepared, but instead of remorse, his words dripped with condescension. "It's just business," he said, flashing an insufferable grin. "You wouldn't understand." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and angry murmurs filled the space, but the loudest sound was the sharp crack of the judge's gavel slamming down. "Order!" she commanded. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Elena Carter's muffled sobs. As the trial continued, one thing became clear. Victor Langley believed he was untouchable, but Judge Holloway's piercing stare suggested otherwise. His reckoning was coming. The fourth day of the trial began with an eerie stillness. The usual buzz of the courtroom had been replaced by a heavier, almost suffocating air. Reporters hunched over their notepads, cameras poised, the spectators whispering in hushed tones. They all sensed it. The moment of reckoning was drawing near. Victor Langley strolled in with the same smug confidence he had worn since day one. Dressed in a deep navy suit, his hair slicked back with precision, he looked more like a man attending a high-profile gala than a defendant on trial for ruining hundreds of lives. He offered a small smirk to the crowd, as if daring them to doubt his inevitable victory. But his usual bravado faltered the moment Judge Margaret Holloway entered. Her sharp gaze scanned the room, pausing ever so slightly on Langley before she took her seat. "Prosecution may proceed," she announced. The lead prosecutor, Michael Grayson, wasted no time. "Your Honor, today, we present irrefutable proof of the defendant's intent to deceive, manipulate, and exploit his victims." On cue, the screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a series of recorded phone calls. Langley's voice, smooth and commanding, directing his team to push investors beyond their limits. "They're desperate," his voice sneered through the speakers. "Tell them whatever they need to hear. Make them feel safe. Then take every last cent." A horrified murmur spread through the crowd. Elena Carter, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth, her face pale. David Holloway's hands curled into fists on his lap. Langley, however, barely reacted. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. Then the final recording played. "Once the dust settles, they'll have nothing left. But hey, it's not personal, it's just business." For the first time, silence consumed the room. Even Langley seemed momentarily caught off guard, his smirk tightening just slightly. The tension snapped when Elena Carter suddenly stood. "You ruined us," she cried, her voice shaking. "You took everything we had." A bailiff moved quickly, urging her to sit, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into a low roar of outrage. Judge Holloway struck her gavel, demanding order, but the atmosphere had changed. Langley was no longer just an untouchable billionaire. He was a predator exposed for the world to see. "Mr. Langley," Judge Holloway's voice was firm, yet controlled, "you may take the stand." Langley hesitated, but his lawyer urged him forward. He strolled to the witness chair, adjusting his tie with practiced ease, his arrogance still intact. Grayson approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Langley, do you recognize these recordings?" Langley exhaled dramatically. "Sure," he said, shrugging. "But let's be honest, people make their own choices. No one forced them to invest." A wave of angry whispers erupted again. Grayson's expression darkened. "You call manipulating and lying to desperate families a choice." Langley smirked. "I call it business. You wouldn't understand." The room gasped. Even the judge's normally impassive face hardened. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "Mr. Langley, let me be very clear. This is not a boardroom. This is a court of law, and here deception carries consequences." Langley only chuckled as if amused. "We'll see about that." But the room could feel it. His grip on control was slipping. He just didn't know it yet. The air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled, every breath held as the jury filed back in. The weeks of testimony, the shocking recordings, the heart-wrenching stories of families left in financial ruin. It had all led to this moment. The people who had suffered at Victor Langley's hands sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions tense, their hands clasped together in silent hope. Langley himself lounged back in his chair, still wearing the same smug confidence he had since the trial began. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. He adjusted his cuff links, flashed a small grin at the cameras, and barely acknowledged the judge as she took her seat. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the room. "Mr. Langley, please rise." For the first time, he hesitated. A flicker of something, annoyance? Unease, crossed his face, but he stood, rolling his shoulders as if this was just another business deal to close. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with deep lines of exhaustion on his face, stood and cleared his throat. "In the case of the United States versus Victor Langley on the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief. Elena Carter clutched her hands to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. David Holloway let out a slow exhale, his jaw unclenching for the first time in weeks. Langley, however, barely reacted. He blinked once, then exhaled as if bored. Judge Holloway's gaze remained locked on him. "Mr. Langley, you have been convicted of orchestrating one of the most egregious financial crimes in recent history. You preyed on hard-working families, manipulating them with false promises, and left them in ruins." Langley finally scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. These people made bad choices. That's not my fault." The room erupted in gasps. Even his own lawyer shot him a look of disbelief. Judge Holloway's expression didn't change. "Your complete lack of remorse only reinforces what this court already knows. You believe yourself untouchable. But today, Mr. Langley, you are not." She straightened. "I hereby sentence you to 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." For the first time, Langley's smirk disappeared. His jaw tensed, his hands curled into fists. "This is a joke," he snapped. "I'll appeal. I'll have your career ruined." Judge Holloway didn't blink. "Bailiffs, remove the defendant." As they grabbed his arms, Langley shouted, his voice frantic now, a sharp contrast to his earlier bravado. "You can't do this. I'm Victor Langley." But no one was listening. As the courtroom erupted into applause, the walls of Victor Langley's empire came crashing down. The downfall of Victor Langley serves as a stark reminder that power and wealth do not place anyone above justice. His arrogance, lack of remorse, and belief that he could manipulate the system ultimately led to his demise. This story carries an important message. Integrity matters. In a world where greed and deception often seem to thrive, honesty and accountability remain the true foundations of success. For those who have been wronged, Langley's conviction is proof that justice, though sometimes slow, prevails. It also highlights the importance of vigilance, being informed, questioning too good to be true promises, and protecting ourselves from financial predators. For those in positions of power, this serves as a cautionary tale. No amount of influence can shield someone forever. The choices we make define our legacy, and in the end, character outweighs wealth. True success comes not from exploitation, but from building something that benefits others, not just oneself. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment number 1 to let us know that you have watched the whole video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.